Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Money View Symposium. Our next session is we're going to have three papers, and we have the commenters, the discussants after the presentations. So let's start with the first one, the underwriting great transformations, political interest, economic ideas, and the political economy of the credit regime change by Dustin Fergusson-Vaux. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And the discussant will be Olan McEvoy. So let's start with that. And we have 15 minutes for that. Is that correct? Yeah. So the floor is yours, Dustin. Please.
All right, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen and share entire screen. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Hello?
Yeah, I think you need to go into
Yeah,
presenter mode.
yeah.
Okay, you can see it though?
Now it's
Yeah,
there.
but we see your screen.
Okay.
Now we see it.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thank you very much. I'll try and cut this shorter than planned. There's a lot of stuff here, but my name is Dustin. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Waterloo. And today I'll be talking to you about my doctoral research in progress. Here we go. So here's a bit of a roadmap of where we're going. I've just highlighted the different sort of sections in different colors, just so you have a subconscious brain trigger about where we're at different stages through the presentation. So the goal is, the overarching goal as per the title is to explain causality for paradigmatic change in different regimes of state credit policy. So I'm looking at all regimes, but for this presentation, I'm just going to be talking about the dirigist regime. So the post-World War II credit policy that's associated with Keynesianism typically. Question that I'm answering in the study is how and why did the government of Canada institute a dirigist regime for making the post-war transition? The thesis is that the government anchored or rather the Bank of Canada anchored the dirigist regime of credit policy by anchoring subaltern credit demands to a Keynesian monetary rule. And the subalterns here are industrial unions and organized agriculture. The causality in this case entailed congruence among three causal elements. So there was a credibility gap in the previous or the incumbent laissez-faire gold standard rule. There was the institutionalization of credit politics, so politicization of credit, and then the specter of a new socio-political order. And these are more heavily emphasized on the domestic than the international, but we'll bring that in too. All right, so I've just distilled the state of the research down to essentially a couple points here. On the right, you'll see a typology that Eric Monet has created a couple years ago. It's very much provisional work, so I'm treating it as such as I go through it and sort of problematize what we do and don't know. But on the most general level, credit policy entails state intervention in the sovereign credit system in order to guide the market allocation process. Essentially, it's to identify gaps in the market, whether de jure or de facto, that the state can come in and close in the public interest, and that is to enable the market system to work effectively. So there's a lot of theory lurking in the background here. The contestation that I've listed here, what is credit policy? This is basically like what the outstanding questions in the the outstanding issues are in the literature. So there is ambiguity as to its generic function, just as a general policy area, irrespective of regime type. There's ambiguity as to its institutional domain, and then also in terms of like what is it in a commonsensical what is it commonsensically, like what is it at an ideological level, again beyond the any particular regime type. I've distilled the literature is quite small anyway. I'm just looking at the literature on the descriptive literature that's current and historical. So I'm really taking a narrow slice of an already small literature to distill into what I'm distilling into these three paradoxes in order to once I resolve these, then to be able to define credit policy systematically at the whole of government level. That's again separated from those three regime types that we just saw. So just briefly, since we are short on time, I've broken this down into three paradoxes. One of policy domicile. So like what are its ubiquitous, what is its ubiquitous function and aims? The next is policy genesis. How is it created? Is it budgetary? Is it off budget? Again, in the Monet study, he's really taking a extreme view purposefully in order to tease out these patterns that were discovered in that historiographical survey. He defines it as spending without taxation, and basically that means like you avoid the budget entirely, but other scholars in sociology and neoclassical economics define it as credit programs are also fiscal. And then one study invokes the notion of maybe it's a third category. So that's where the policy genesis is coming from. Policy embeddedness is just the notion that how and where is it embedded at all different levels of the system. So the money view gives us a clear notion of that internationally through the state system, but then domestically, if I can distill this down to one issue, it's the separability construct, which is at the core of neoclassical economics, and I'll get to as I'm assuming that many of you know what that is. But I'll get to that as we move on. So in a money view, I'm defining credit policy as public-private market making for underwriting, shaping, and making the market economy in the image of different Minskian stages of capitalist development. So here's just a table of Minsky's typology. States here are market makers of first resort for national policy making. And as per the discussion about spending without taxation just a minute ago, I'm defining it as spending without taxation or nearly so. And this is in light of what Sarah Quinn calls its political lightness. It can be made to seem more like the state or more like the market, depending on how you structure the credit program. It could be made to seem like it's not touching the budget with really rudimentary accounting practices, as well as a process that she calls fiscal lightness. So it has large bang for the buck. Basically, it looks like the impact will essentially impress constituents enough that relative to the small outlay for the program, people won't really question it as a cost. So these are just three barriers that I'm going to blow by in the event of time, which I'm happy to come back to. But I basically just discovered I basically summarized the way I'm defining credit policy through the money view in terms of these three propositions that we ought to have in common, as Professor Merling says about the money view and generally for understanding credit policy. So skipping the methodology, I can discuss why Canada is important in the Q&A. So I'm treating the money view in this framework that I'm building as a world ordering strategy around the driving logic of finance. And here are all the fundamental processes, infrastructures, agents, the elemental social relation of credit, and the like that you're all familiar with from the money view literature. So the money view is the world is seen from the money view. I'm just lining those elements on the previous slide up with essentially the title of the talk and going, this is where they all fall in line. Keep going ahead just so I can actually show you the regime change typology. Basically, we need a historical institutionalist framework. There are some barriers. There are all these dimensions that aren't just institutional. Fortunately, there are two paradoxes that once we resolve them in the methodological literature, it enables us to combine all these parts with other congruent frameworks and basically provide a reflexive model of regime change for the period we're looking at. So essentially what I'm doing is the straight line at the bottom is our thwarted, like Minsky thwarting mechanisms. So some of you might have seen the institutional supercycles framework by de Fermos and Gabor. I'm basically taking that line and I'm taking the money view concepts and going, well, what if we traced the whole process along the super cycles and then subsequently the interregnum period, because that's really what we're modeling when we're looking at how regime change occurs. We're going into that interregnum period, and then we're explaining how the old order dies basically, and how the new regime gets constructed. So at the beginning, you have an ideological settlement with a credit policy, let's say a tight money policy. It's embedded within a national policy framework. You get the institutional supercycle where institutional thwarting mechanisms are rigid. They actually have the capacity to contain to manage the growth process. As it gets closer to the end of the supercycle, you approach a point where a critical juncture becomes more likely. So the great crash in this example. Then once that happens, there is an interval that needs to transpire between which the monetary authorities have to palpably not be able to recover the growth process in the midst of the systematic crisis after the Minsky moment. Then if it goes on for long enough in a demonstrably obvious enough way for the general public, then you get ideological unsettlement of both the national policy but particularly the incumbent monetary rule. And then the intervening process is an institutional counter cycle where the thwarting mechanisms don't work and growth is stagnant and or negative. The institutions are plastic, and then at that point, the paradox of embedded agency becomes active. And basically, this is with Gramsci's like morbid symptoms, and you get what Rune Muller-Stahl has modeled in his framework as the rise of hegemonic conflict, as well as a realignment among the main sectional class and elite forces in society. So this is just filling in the previous slide I showed. I basically have just added all of the frameworks that I'm using to the descriptive narrative that was given in 2 slides ago, just to show you how they all fit together into one coherent framework. They follow that pattern the super cycles and counter cycles pattern I just showed. How am I doing for time, by the way?
You have 5 minutes more.
Oh, okay. So I thought I was pushing it a little tighter. Okay, so we've resolved the two paradoxes. The outcome, processes, causes, activities, and entities. These are all from the process tracing methodology that I'm using to put together this massive framework in conjunction with Sheila Dow's open systems approach to economic analysis. It basically puts bounds on the process. It makes you define and reject the separability construct, which is the notion that the economy can be disembedded from society, values, and the environment. It makes you reject closed systems and binary thinking. And then you have to define the bounds of what you're studying in terms of the containment strategy. So you're basically trying to you're justifying like what your how your study it sorry how it exemplifies an open systems framework. That was tough. And then the third stage, the theory building stage, all that Professor Dow says is that you should use paradoxes existing to resolve the problematic at hand. There's no template that she gives in her framework, so that's why I'm bringing in the Beach and Peterson process tracing methodology. It basically forces you to use the ontological and epistemological and ontological logic of the main framework you're using, and then take other open system research from scholars that are also using open system frameworks, and that can be neoclassical. It just doesn't have to it has to be research where the researchers are open to in the particular study to an evolutionary epistemology. So that's a lot. So this is basically what I was getting at in that graph. What I'll direct your attention to is the nation building settlements play out along that super cycle period. That's basically the nation state institution inside of which all the thwarting mechanisms get designed. So you have your allocative settlement, which comes from the monetary policy rule, and that determines which credit regime you get. All of those national policy prongs and key policies at the bottom are the thwarting mechanisms. I just broken them down into industry, infrastructure, and society building. I've basically just added things that are related to credit policy and the growth process to the Fermos and Gabor framework. Happy to come back to this later. This is an alignment using their framework of how the thwarting mechanisms actually, like where they're situated in terms of floor and ceiling mechanisms. The extensions refer to add-ons basically between when the national policy is designed at the beginning of the super cycle and then when you enter the interregnum period. So we're going to enter the next stage through the causes of erosion, the long run processes row, and the developmental intermezzo column. So right here. This is causal element one on very broad strokes. There's a cause, the Great Crash. There is a mechanism, which is the credibility gap. These four mechanistic elements have to, or in the case I looked at, they were triggered in succession and then triggered each other accordingly. And in the end, produced a legitimation gap for the laissez-faire gold standard rule. At the same time, the crash triggered a process of reflexive collation. So this is basically where everyone's learning from each other at the same time, all of the economists on the various sides of the conflict. Institutionalization of credit politics. Here's the last one. Wartime industrial peace. Workers don't have any. There's no Wagner Act in Canada, as the economy bores into full employment and price and wage controls hit their peak in 1942-43. Reflexive crystallization is just post-war planning's going on, and all of the interests are taking their sides now, particularly in around Bretton Woods is just around the corner too. So then you get by-elections where you get a really high projection for the market socialist party that's the runner-up to the liberals. So you get those three causal elements. They come together at a watershed moment. This is analogous to Keynes's famous quote where he says the politicians have ears, not eyes, and they'll only respond to the call from the great public. So that happens, and then there's a process where the easy money rule gets anchored into the expectations of gets tailored to the expectations of the interests that get bailed into the historical block, and then projected on outward to the public. And then once you get, so I'm going to walk through this really fast. Once you get
we are running out of, so please wrap up
okay.
to then give the floor to Olan.
Okay, so once you get the super cycle on the post-war end, then you get sublimation from the general population, and you basically have acceptance of your regime at that point. So in very broad strokes, that's how that all breaks down. I hope that was coherent, and thank you very much for your time. Apologies, Olan, for cutting into the discussion time.
No worries, Olan.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation, Dustin. I think that this was perhaps the paper that you presented at Finance and Society last September when we were on the same panel, or at least something somewhat similar. So I'm glad to see it develop since then. It's really interesting. So yeah, okay. My summary of your paper would be that the paper argues that Canadian nation building occurred through successive political settlements that stabilized capitalism by reorganizing credit allocation, with the Great Depression being the main trigger to go from laissez-faire finance capitalism to a Keynesian dirigiste regime. Yeah, my main impression is that I really enjoyed reading this paper. I'm glad to see somebody else working on historical credit regimes. You use these concepts like Minskian supercycles and thwarting mechanisms that I've also used in my own work, which is I presented earlier today, my paper on US housing finance. But I think you do a much better job at outlining causal mechanisms. And yeah, I'll take some inspiration from that for my own paper. Yeah, I admit to knowing very little about the Canadian case, but that's actually what I think makes it so interesting. My impression as an outsider is that Canada tends to be a bridge between Europe and North America. So in this paper, we could perhaps see Canada as being a midway point between French dirigisme credit policy and the US is changed during the New Deal, which is more about de-risking, as I outlined in my own paper. And I understand why you didn't want to go into too many details about Canada. I come from a smaller country which has a much larger neighbor, which most people focus on as well. And so we tend to not want to bore people with the details, but actually, I think that the details about Canada are what makes the paper interesting, right? And this is something that really needs to be emphasized. Why is Canada different? Is it a case of a mid-size power country? Maybe you wouldn't categorize Canada as that back then, but it's what Mark Carney characterized it as now. But is it a case of a mid-sized country conforming to the international regime that's in place at the same time? my question would be, should we be surprised about what we see in Canada, right? Because what we see is perhaps Canada following other countries in this case. I mean, it happened in the United States that they moved towards a more directed credit regime. And should we be surprised that their smaller neighbor then does something similar? So yeah, that was kind of one of the things, is to think about, is Canada out of step with anything that's happening internationally, or is it just a subject of international trends that are actually acting on it? And because you're focusing on the domestic political settlement, right? This is what you believe is the causal mechanism, even if there are these ideological influences from abroad. At least this is how I interpreted it, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I found the connection between credit regimes and nation building to be really interesting. I think this is a productive avenue to go down. It would be interesting to bring in some of the more classic texts of political science in this. This is something that we've been thinking about with one of the papers that I'm involved in recently, is trying to submit it to a mainstream political science journal. And like, you could talk to literature from Tilly and Mann and Weber and even James Scott about talking about how projects of high modernism have failed. And yeah, trying to kind of burst out of our political economy bubble that understands the money view and maybe speaking to mainstream political scientists, I would think would be really great. But of course, that's up to you. Yeah, I will try and not go too much further over time, but let me just see, did I have anything else to say? Yeah, I find it really nice that you tried to outline these causal mechanisms through process tracing. Yeah, it's the thing about that. I guess it runs the risk of that, like, credit policies are endogenous to the causality that you're trying to outline. That's not necessarily a weakness of the paper. Many things are endogenous and makes them harder to study, but yeah, I wonder, thinking about that more and trying to outline more of these critical junctures, which really highlight why credit policy is the thing that this hinges on, and not other things that credit policy is then just following. Yeah, and then I think you try to cover a lot, and I think it's really great, like especially your outline of the literature as it is right now. I found it really useful myself. I think it's quite broad, and maybe it could be made more clear by paring it down to focus more on just these causal elements, because you bring in many, many different aspects of the Canadian political economy, and this is great. But then I guess maybe in a single journal article, does the story get a little bit muddied by all of these elements? But yeah, nevertheless, I found this paper to be really interesting. I'm going to take some inspiration from myself, and I'm really looking forward to reading it once it's printed in the journal sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dustin, if you want to comment on Olan's intervention, and then you have 5 minutes, and then we open the floor for other questions.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks, Olan. I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely the endogenous focus. I need to bring in the international just enough, but not too much, and I think the way to do that is that, so there's a liquidity regime collapse, right? Basically, that's when you get what I'm calling the dirigist liquid sovereign imperative. It's a riff on a term that Daniela Gabor came up with. And yeah, basically once Glass-Steagall gets passed, that has to happen. So there's that one element. Let me answer the other one actually by going to the why Canada. Why Canada? There's 4 reasons. There's clear critical junctures. It traces all the causal mechanics that I could find and could reduce everything to. Traces all of the money view elements, and it is independent of reconstruction. So the first 2 things, the clear critical junctures. Canada establishes a central bank later than every other British Dominion, except actually it's on the same year as New Zealand, but that's still like the two latest. Because of there's with Charles Calomiris and Stephen Haber, they model the bank bargain, basically confederation. There's like the chartered banks and the federal government, and the regionally divided mercantile class. And then on the institution end, at the end of the war, the Canadian government's like really dragging their feet. Like they're not. The prime minister's not going to jump. The technocrats in the Department of Finance and Bank of Canada are moving in that direction. One of them is a really well-known disciple of Keynes, Robert Bryce, but the prime minister and the cabinet will not budge. And even after the Beveridge report, and even after FDR endorses it, it takes like a year and a half until after FDR endorses it. And so it's not that they wouldn't have done it anyway, but it gives a really clear trigger. It has a really the advantage of it's like you can see where the only thing left to cause the shift was the buildup of electoral forces, and then the independent of Reconstruction. It is not one of like I have to puzzle over whether how generalizable any of this would be in any case, because Western Europe had to be reconstructed, and so Canada was not part of the cohort of countries that went under the Marshall Plan. So I think that actually makes it more generalizable to today in some respects, where like it's effectively on the state's own volition at the point that the third congruent causal element was triggered. So I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Dustin. Any question from the audience? We just have a few more minutes. I wanted to ask you because if no one is screening, I'm going to ask because the proposal is to like the policy proposal is to align the credit regime to the national building, and it seems that that is something from after-war policies, not something that is that is not very fashionable today. And understanding the credit system and the monetary system, how it is now, which is more a system that allows these payments of debt instead of really being connected with macro policy for, let's say, developing industrial or the real economy. So how are you connecting the reality of the system as it is today with this policy alignment that you are proposing?
So it's basically motivated by, okay, there for a long time we've known we needed to do a green transition, and there was just I think there was it often felt like people who wanted something like more in the state-led modality to do a green transition, especially a just green transition, were just kind of assuming that you could vote it in with like without a strong like without global conditions behind it, as well as like the collapsible liquidity regime. And then there was a very strong movement domestically, including academics, including labor and farmers and progressives. But basically, I was trying to isolate like what did it take? What did it take? And then we can look at the Eric Monet provides, and other scholars, a lot of really great deep analysis on how and the ways in which the state finance nexus have deepened. So that has to be considered. Obviously, you can't use the same level, like type of propaganda that you did back then and today. And so I'll basically just be outlining like what are the other conditions that are different that we would have to negotiate today or look out for. But basically these processes, I think they still transfer, like the reflexive collation process. You get a point where everyone is looking for the new hegemonic playbook basically inside of any given state system. And I think that would happen. It's the biggest takeaway for the green transition folks would be if you don't have anything on the table, which is the case in Canada where I'm from and a lot of other places, then you're not going to get your ideas into that collation process. That's it. And so it's a shortish answer to the question.
Okay, thank you. And we are on time to finish. So let's continue with the next one. So we have regional payment agreements in Latin America, and the presenter is Marcelo Bruchanski, and the discussant is Nicolas Aguila. So the floor is yours. So you have 50 minutes, and then we have 10 minutes for comments, and then we open the floor.
Thank you very much. I think that Dustin is still sharing. I don't know if someone else is sharing, so I cannot.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Dustin still sharing. Okay, now it's okay. So let me share with you my presentation. No, okay. I'm going to talk about regional payment agreement in Latin America. This is based on an article that was published last year by Latin Lab. And I had the chance to share with you this article, so I wanted to participate. And thank you very much for letting me participate in this symposium. I am now in Buenos Aires, where I live. You know about all this, the regulation. Well, there is a construction next door, so you may hear the noise, which is not allowed, but they do it anyway because it is not only about financial deregulation, everything is deregulated. And constructing buildings is about money laundering, so everything is related to everything. So I'm sorry if you hear some noise in my presentation. Okay. I work at Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento, which is in Buenos Aires province. And the first thing I talk about in the article is going back to some literature that it was very, very famous. I would say there was a lot of literature in the first decade of this century, from 2000 to 2010, more or less, because at that time the European Monetary Union was a success. So in Latin American Orthodox and heterodox economies wanted to do something like that and resemble the European Monetary Union. There was another idea more related to the government at that time that were against the US and say, okay, we need a regional financial architecture that will replace the international one. So instead of International Monetary Fund, we need a regional monetary fund and a lot of institutions that can replace the international one. And then we have the proposal to create Banco del Sur. And all of them are very mixed up. And one of the things that I wanted to do is to go back to that time, which is not so far away, and see what's happened, and try to clarify that it is not all the same, that behind regional financial and monetary cooperation, there is a lot of things that are very, very different. So I wanted to clarify that because I'm going to talk about something very specific, which are payment agreements or clearing agreements. And it is not a regional monetary fund. It is not multilateral banks. or anything like that, and it is not about the monetary union. And I start to explain what are regional payment agreement or regional clearing agreement. I think it's another term that is used. With this diagram that was done by the League of Nations in 1935, it is funny because this report from the League of Nations is very, very critical regarding clearing agreement. However, the diagram is very good, so I use it. And as you can see in a payment agreement, what you have is that import from a country paying national currency to the clearing office, and the clearing office pay to the exporter from that country. So there are not hard currency transactions between the exporter and importer, and mostly clearing office are the central banks. Not all the cases, but mostly. And in case there are some clearing office that accumulate credit and the other clearing office accumulate debit, there is the possibility of settlement in hard currency. Sometimes the settlement is every day, sometimes it's every 4 months, sometimes it's every 6 months. It depends on the agreement, and it is not always the case. And let's see, what are they for? The literature mostly thinks of two reasons why we need regional payment agreements, that they are good for to promote international trade. I mean, as a complementary to regional integration regarding trade. So it is good for importers and exporters because they have less transaction costs. I mean, you pay in domestic currency, so you don't need to go to the exchange rate, to the exchange market, to the foreign exchange market. There is the possibility that as I accumulate credit, that I only can take by importing from the other country, so the other country will be able to export more, and so debts are paid with export instead of gold, instead of sterling, instead of dollar. So it facilitates reciprocity, because if I have to decrease my tariff in the case of an integration, trade integration agreement, then it is easy to decrease my tariff if I know that I will not get in debt, that I will be able to pay my debts with my export and not with dollars. So it helps a lot in the process of regional integration regarding trade. And the other thing is that regional payment agreements are good for foreign exchange saving, because you don't have to pay your imports with your reserves, so you don't have to be aware of how much reserves you got to pay for your imports. And the other thing is that as it is settled in a net basis, so you don't pay for every import, you just settle after all the credits and debits are summed, and then you see if you have to pay or you have to, or the other country have to pay to you. So that's where you save US dollars, you save hard currency. So this is mostly what the literature says. And what I explain in this article is that, in my opinion, there are three kinds of regional payment agreements. We can think about the 30s, where that's when they started, where Germany was the main country participating in this agreement, but this agreement was not only about Germany. Then we have another stage after the Second World War, when during the Golden Age, and I think that the most important in that case is the European Payment Union. And then we have very strange 21st century regional payment agreements that are different and are not so complete. And I'm working on this topic, and there is a paper that will be coming up soon. It is published by the Review of Financial Economics. I think in next April will be published, I hope. I also wrote a paper with my director, which is called Regional Payment Agreement, an Alternative to Currency Convertibility, which is from 2023. It's 3 years old. And so I think that this article that I wrote last year sums up some of these things. So I go to the regional payment agreements in Latin America. I think the most important one was by far what we call Convenio de Pagos y Créditos Recíprocas. In English, it's Reciprocal Payment and Credit Agreement. It was made in the context of Latin American trade agreement, first ALAL and then in the 80s ALABI. And it was proposed by structuralist economists in Latin America. And there are some papers from Raúl Prebisch, for instance, that he discussed this payment agreement. They want to resemble what happened with the European Payment Union. And I think this payment agreement was settled every 6 months. I'm sorry, every 4 months. And it includes a lot of countries, all the countries in South America. So it was very interesting. We can see here that this agreement was very successful, and you can see how from the 60s it increased a lot. And in the 80s, during the debt crisis in Latin America, it was used a lot. Central banks considered that it was compulsory to use this this payment agreement to pay for other countries in the region. However, after the 80s and when in the 90s, a lot of neoliberal governments came to power, this kind of agreement was not used any longer or was decreased. Someone is going. I don't worry. There's some noise outside the world. Then we can see that Brazil and Venezuela tried to use it in 2006, 2008, at the first years of the century. However, it was not used as it was before. I think that the 70s, 80s were the time where this kind of integration and this payment agreement was used. Then we have the other two payment agreements, which is Sistema de Pagos en Monedas Locales, payment system in local currency, which is part of the Mercosur, and it is bilateral. And the first one was between Brazil and Argentina in 2008. Then we have another one, which is the Subsistema Unitario de Compensación Regional, which was created by ALBA countries, Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia. At the time, both of them were a consequence of the failure of Banco del Sur. The South Bank didn't work out because the differences between Brazil and Venezuela. So we have these two payment agreements. The first one is very, very simple, which is good and bad at the same time because it is settled every day. So there is no foreign exchange saving. It is used mostly by Brazil. All the exports from Brazil to Argentina are, many exports from Brazil to Argentina are done using this mechanism. However, Argentina exporters don't use it. And the reason is that you know that the financial system in Brazil use a lot of domestic currency. However, in Argentina, exporters prefer to receive US dollars, so they prefer to export and denominate the exports in US dollars. So what you see is that the exports from Brazil are in the first exit, and they are they are not very high, but they are important. However, the exports from Argentina to Brazil are non-existent. They are mostly nothing. I was told that they are mostly devolution, things that were exported from Brazil to Argentina, but by mistake they have to go back. So it's completely zero. No export from Argentina to Brazil using this mechanism. And the reason is that Argentine exporter doesn't like to denominate the export in pesos, whereas for Brazilian companies, it's the same. And the same happened with this SUCRE, which is Sistema Unitario de Compensación Regional, and mostly works because of exports from Ecuador to Venezuela. And the reason was similar, because Ecuador is dollarized, so Ecuador exporters were okay using the system. However, export from Venezuela to Ecuador prefer to use US dollar because you know that the Venezuelan currency was under a lot of capital control. So and
You
there
have
was
minutes to wrap up, please.
okay. Yes, of course. And I am finishing. Thank you. And so I think that we have to think about regional payment agreement not just as a tool, but something that it is very useful to promote regional trade, which is something that nowadays might sound weird because of the change in government in the region and all the things that are going on. But I think that we have to keep this in mind for another time, perhaps. This is very good also for a country like Argentina that has a lot of problems with external constraints. The other thing is that we have to know that regional payment agreements are good to promote new regional trade flows. And this is something Raul Previs discussed a lot because when you have a credit, you need to import more to so that way you get your debt paid. So I think it's very interesting that it is very good mechanism to promote more international trade, but also monetary and financial autonomy in this world where there is a lot of dispute and it's very difficult for emerging countries, for peripheral countries to sustain the monetary system. Where in this case, I think that regional payment agreements should be taken into account. So thank you very much. Any complaints you can write to this email, and whatever questions are welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. And then Nicolas, the floor is yours for discussions.
Great, thank you. So hi. Sorry, what did you say?
You have 10 minutes.
Okay, I will probably be shorter than that, so we have more time for discussion. Well, I'm quite happy to be here discussing this paper. I actually had the chance to read it, and it's an excellent paper. I recommend everyone to read it. I particularly enjoyed this section on the historical context of the different regional payment agreements, which I think is something that is largely missing in the literature. And I found that to be quite original and quite interesting. So I actually have three questions, which we could call the economic question, the political question, and the technical question to simplify things. Let me just start with the economic one. I think that to a large extent, the appeal of this regional payment or clearing system is that they allow to expand trade, right? But they require the existence of a surplus country that is willing to finance the deficits of deficit countries. However, for the system to work in the long run and to reach an equilibrium, this situation needs to be reversed at some point, so that the original surplus country needs to be willing to hold deficits for a time, and so in order to get paid, basically, as you were mentioning. And I think that this is something that is quite tricky in general. This is quite a usual critique of these kind of agreements. But I think that this is particularly the case in South America, where you have a country that, like Brazil, who is huge and has a huge trade surplus with everyone else. And even bilaterally, I think that with literally every country in the region, Brazil has a huge trade surplus. So for this system to work for a time, what you will need is Brazil to be willing to extend credit, but then at some point to be willing to reverse its net deficit with the rest of the region. So this is something that is, I think, tricky in economic terms, because it will require a huge transformation of the productive structure of every country other than Brazil. And I was thinking, and I want to ask your opinion on this, that maybe one way to entice the Brazilians to partake in such a system would be to allow them to have the reserve currency of the system. And so maybe they will be willing to trade, their deficits for the exorbitant privilege that will give them their position in the region, like the US, who runs huge deficits, but issues the dollar. My second question is the political question, which is quite related to the economic one. I mean, this fact that Brazil has to move to deficit, it's also a huge political issue, and it will require the willingness and the political lead of Brazil to do that. Something that I don't see happening for the time being, and historically, I think Brazil has been a bit reluctant to lead processes of regional integration. But maybe this is something that changes. But still, there is another issue that I found quite interesting in your paper, which is about the shortcomings of the Sucre. And I found this particularly interesting because one option that I found a couple of times in the literature is that, well, making these regional payment systems is something very complicated to get many countries on board, but you can start small. You can start with a couple of countries that are more or less politically or ideologically aligned or well integrated in commercially and so on and so forth. But with the Sucre, we had that, right? So we have 4 or 5 countries that were quite on the same political / ideological, that had political or ideologically aligned governments, and still it failed. And I found super interesting your explanation of why that had been the case, meaning that the Venezuelans were overbilling the imports to get access to dollars. But well, in any case, I wanted to ask you about, well, how do you think of these political constraints, and what are the lessons that we can learn from the experiences that you reviewed on the topic? And finally, my technical question, I think that it was super interesting to see how you classified different regional clearing systems based on the different characteristics in terms of the design, in terms of the use of a new unit of account or an existing unit of account, the difference between the period in which the settlement was made, and plenty of other characteristics that you described on the paper. And you also mentioned that some systems like the SML between Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay is super simple, but still not really used, whereas other systems that were used for a time were much more complex. And one will assume that, well, okay, this more complex system will not be used. But well, in any case, I want to ask you if you have any thoughts of what will be the best design for such a system in the region. And also, given that we discussed a lot during these past 2 days about CBDCs and stable coins and so on, where you think that the use of distributed ledger technology might be a way to solve any of the issues or not, or it's just a new technology that will do exactly the same as we had before, just differently. But well, I want to conclude with that, and again, thank you for the paper, and I'm quite looking forward to reading the upcoming papers that you mentioned as well. So congrats on them.
Okay, Marcelo, if you want to answer the questions, and then we open the floor for other questions.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for reading the paper and all these questions. First, the economic problem that the country accumulates surplus a lot of trades and the other country accumulate deficits and debits. So this, we can go to history and we can see that this happened with Germany in the European Banking Union, that at first it was a deficit country, and then it would change that. And the other case we can see this is in an agreement between Finland and the Soviet Union, that when the oil price increased a lot in the 70s, the Soviet Union was suddenly had a lot of surplus regarding Finland, so they started to buy more because they didn't want to destroy the agreement. So they started to buy a lot of things to Finland. So they make a lot of effort to keep this agreement. But they are very, very special cases. But I think that most of the time it's what you say. So it requires that the country that has the deficit, the trade, wants to buy more. And that's what actually came explained in about the International Trade Union, that they proposed that the objective was that the deficit, that the trade country buys more from the deficit country. And that's what one of the most important conclusion that we can get from that. And politically is very, very difficult. However, I think that the good thing is that it is not that you have to completely erase the trade. I mean, you can settle in hard currency, so you can go slowly. Although you have a trade and the other country have a debit, okay, every 4 months you settle that debt in hard currency, and that's it. I mean, it's better than nothing. So I think that what you're saying is completely true, but, but I think that there are some simple solutions that could be done and well done, really. Regarding the technical shortcomings, I think that I think that they don't change much. That the CBDC and the central bank digital currency doesn't change much because I think money is already digital, so it doesn't make much sense. It can improve it, but it's all in the central bank accounting, so it doesn't change much. It is a big question about Brazil because I think that the problem between Venezuela and Brazil was that in Banco del Sur, that Brazil had a surplus, trade surplus with everyone, bilaterally and globally. So they didn't Brazil was not interested in a payment agreement that they would accumulate a lot of trade, and it would be very difficult for them. So I think that the question about Brazil in South America, such a huge country regarding all the others, it's still there. And I think that we don't have the answer yet.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you, Marcelo. I have a question. I am not seeing questions in the chat. Anyone has any question? Otherwise, I will ask my question. I will do it. So I think it's very interesting, this regimen. Perry has one. I'm just going to ask really quickly my question, and then Perry, you are next. My question is, I think this is very interesting, and I'm seeing the case of the Asian +3 and the importance of having a strong currency as an anchor for the system. And I think they have the ASEAN is working really well, and that is reflected in the reserves of the central banks, where they have to have this strong currency, and they have created this clearinghouse between them. So they have the structures already in place that I haven't seen in Latin America. And remember that they have China, and that doesn't obstacle the possibility of having these systems. So why in Latin America we cannot do that if we are seeing like China is integrating its payments with the region and is working. So what is, I don't know if you have seen this case and what we can learn from them, and what is our failure comparing to the ASEAN +3 regional bloc.
Thank you, Marina. I haven't seen this case, so I won't be able to answer your question. I'm sorry, but I think it's a very, very good thing that we have to go on now and see what's going on there. What I think at first is that, at least in Latin America, the monetary system should be complementary to the productive structure. So I think there is a lot of complementary in Southeast Asia between the industrial economies. We didn't have that. I mean, we are primary exporting countries, exporting to the Europe and then to Asia now, and so we don't have a lot of industrial relation among us. So I think that's the first problem, but they are very, very related. So it's not that monetary things came out of nothing and we increase trade. I think that it will be helpful to industrial development. So I think that's the thing I can say, but I'm sorry, I don't know much about this agreement.
Thank you. Perry, your question, please.
Yes. So this analogy that you make with the European Payments Union, okay, I want to just develop that a little bit. Okay, so that happens. I don't really know much about the Latin American, situation, but I do know about the European Payments Union. And what I note is that this was all run on the balance sheet of the Bank for International Settlements. Okay, so not on a national balance sheet, but on the balance sheet of the Bank of International Settlements, which was its liabilities were basically, promises to pay gold, that the BIS. So this gets to the point that this was a strong bank. This was the central bank for all central banks. And so that's what made this whole thing go. That's number one. And so I wonder if there is some institution like that in Latin America. Secondly, okay, it's important to appreciate that Europe as a whole, okay, was a deficit country. Europe as a whole was a deficit country to the rest of the world, okay? And I don't know what if that, what is the situation with Latin America? And so how did that work? Because the rest of the world was not part of this regional situation. How did that work? How that worked was basically, that the United States filled that deficit with the Marshall Plan and NATO and military stuff. So I think that's important to appreciate that regional payments, okay, are subsidiary to global settlement. Settlement is global, ultimately. And so you need to be thinking about, so that may be one of the reasons why these things haven't really worked. I don't know. Is Latin America, are these countries in deficit to the rest of the world? Or are they in surplus to the rest of the world? So I don't know, but that would be a relevant consideration.
Thank you very much for your comment. Actually, if you sum up all Latin America countries regarding the rest of the world in the 20, 30 years, there's a clear surplus. And in the current account, the thing is that you have to then add capital flight and other kind of things. So it's complicated and it's not so clear that we have a surplus. And it is clear that there was a geopolitical issue that the US wanted to promote development in Europe after the war. And that's why the Marshall Plan, and that's why actually the Marshall Plan went to finance the European Payment Union. So it was very important, the Marshall Plan, for that payment. We don't have that. Actually, the IMF was against the payment agreement in Latin America when they were asked if they wanted to say something to promote this payment agreement. They said, no, we are against that. So I think that we don't have that. At that time, we didn't have that geopolitical help, and now we don't have them either. I think it's worse. I think it's interesting about the BIS. In the case of Latin America, it's the Bank of Peru that acts as a clearing agent, and then it is settled in the New York Bank, in the New York, I think, yes, in the New York, in New York. I don't know if the foreign exchange market, I think. And, but it is not the same. I mean, I haven't thought about it, but the BIS was important also because after the BIS there was gold, so you have a reserve currency after all. But and in the case of the Bank of Peru, that was the clearing nation, you don't have that. And I think you're right. One of the things that it is very critical about this regional payment agreement is that Brazil, for instance, had a trade surplus with the other South American countries. However, they might have a deficit trade with the rest of the world. So you have that problem that they are accumulating trade in Latin America, whereas they are accumulating debt with the rest of the world, and they don't want that. So that's one thing that you have to take into account. I mean, that's the main difference with the International Clearing Union of Keynes. Keynes was thinking about the whole world, and the regional payment agreements are regional, so you have to pay attention to the relation with the rest of the world. You're right.
Thank you, Marcelo. Let's do 10 minutes of a break, and then we'll start, maybe 13 minutes, and then we'll start at 25. Okay?